talk today with Rick Sturim of Wyoming, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Rick, can you begin with some background on yourself, and to start with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and yes, a tree does grow in Brooklyn.
Well, maybe more than one.
Maybe.
All right. What year?
October 1942 is when I was born, and we lived there until I started kindergarten. Then we moved to New Jersey, Hawthorne, New Jersey. We were there in that city for 4 years, and then in fourth grade moved to Fair Lawn, New Jersey, which is where I spent most of my life until I went into college.
Okay. Talk a little bit about your family background. Where is your father from, for instance, and what did he do?
My father was from Hell's Kitchen in New York. So my mother was in that same area. It was a place where there were 3 gangs on every street, one on either end, one in the middle, and his father was a superintendent in an apartment house, and he ended up, he was in the Navy during the war, special assignment because of his eyes, so he never went overseas. He was stationed in Norfolk, and then I went to college after Air Force, or after high school. There was no question. After 12th grade came freshman year in college, and that's the way it was. My father was not a college graduate, but had attended Pace Institute and a number of others for accounting. He ended up retiring from Curtiss Wright Aeronautical in Woodridge, New Jersey, where he was an expediter. He tried other things. He was in business with Excello stencil photo engraving when Patterson, New Jersey was Silk City, very much like right here in West Michigan. And he did printing on silk. He also tried a hobby shop named Rick's Hobby after me. Neither one worked out real well, so he went to work, and where he retired from was Curtiss Wright. So.
Okay. So when did you finish high school?
In 1960, I graduated,
Okay.
and then went to college in the same year, later that year, at Newark College of Engineering, which is now New Jersey Institute of Technology, the school that beat Michigan the first year, and they didn't even know the name of the school at the time. I spent 4 years there. I graduated as a mechanical engineer in ROTC. As a freshman, you went in and you had 2 choices. You either wanted ROTC or you didn't want ROTC. So I left my options open and I went into ROTC. That was the same in your sophomore year. Then in your junior year, you selected a discipline. And I selected mechanical engineering, but now in the advanced corps, I stayed in ROTC.
Now, within the ROTC, had you chosen a service branch, or would that come later?
We only had Air Force ROTC.
Okay.
Newark College of Engineering put more engineers in the Air Force than any other school outside of the academy. So we offered 5 different disciplines of engineering, and that was it. My choice was mechanical because I've always been interested in cars and mechanical devices and that.
All right. Now, the period, this is the now kind of Cold War era, Kennedy's president during the time when you're in school, all of this stuff. You get Berlin Wall, you get Cuban Missile Crisis. How much attention were you paying to what was going on in the rest of the world when you were in college?
Not an awful lot. We had a summer camp for ROTC, and mine was at Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod. And it was the time when Jackie Kennedy was having the miscarriage, and we went out to the flight line when JFK landed, and he waved to his security guard and walked over to us with the chagrin of the security, and I was this close to him as I am to you. And that's when you could see how, even in that short a period of time, it was telling on him, because you could see how it had aged him. And of course, it wasn't much long after that that he was assassinated. So, and as I say, I left my options open to me. My initial orders came after I was commissioned in 1964, and they wanted me to be a weatherman. So I said, that's fine. Where do I get my
Okay.
training? And then
Now, before we kind of get into that, let's go back into a little bit. Within the ROTC program, what were you actually doing?
well, first of all, I was captain of the ROTC rifle team in college. I was also captain of the college rifle team, and that got me involved in the athletic association. I was a fraternity member. It was a local fraternity, Phi Beta Tau, which eventually became TEAC, Tau Cap Epsilon. But I was eligible to get into anything I wanted to get into. Had a good friend, not a good friend, a friend who was also of the same religious persuasion I am, and he found discrimination every place he turned. I never saw any of that. Different personality. And I am Jewish, was born, raised, and am still presently in that persuasion. So,
Now, is your last name one that got at the Ellis Island treatment, or?
well, unless I tell you I am, there's no way of indicating that I am Jewish. I
Right.
don't look it. Typically, they say, oh, Jews have big noses and that, and it doesn't fit my style. On the east side of the Atlantic, our name was Sturimsky, and when it came through Ellis Island, it became Sturim. My mother's name was Rygrotsky on the other side, and it was Rigrod on this side,
Okay.
as a lot of other people. And my parents grew up in a typically Jewish neighborhood. European neighborhood is more likely. And then my father diversified a little bit from there, but staying in northern Jersey, Fair Lawn, New Jersey, it was a very ethnic town. It still is, largely a Jewish population.
Okay. But in terms of what was going on at school, you just kind of fit in and sort of not an issue.
I never pushed the point, and nobody ever pushed it with me. The fraternity I joined because it was founded by 13 people who could not all join one fraternity due to ethnic reasons or
Right.
background or whatever. And that's what I wanted. I don't live in a world of only one culture. And that's the way I've brought my kids up.
Okay. Now, within the actual framework of the ROTC itself, what kind of training do they give you while you're in it?
Not a lot towards military. You learn that, as a second lieutenant, Brown Bar second lieutenant, which you're going to come out as, if you can associate all the way up to captains, you're lucky. It did not turn out that way when I actually got on active duty. They teach you a lot of protocol. We did not do a lot of marching in that. We had to have our uniforms, and it was inspected and all. But they did not really prepare you well for military life. In December of '64, I left my house and drove to Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois and drove into the Air Force and with wide-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Okay. So what sort of reception then do you get when you show up? What happens to you once you get to Chanute?
Well, the guard at the gate told me where to go, and it was at the time a barracks that had been being resurrected. It was not very nice, but I needed to find a place to eat and all, so I rode around and saw this thing called an officer open mess. I rode past it a couple times. Finally, I said, well, I'm an officer. I'm going to go in. Turned out that was the officers' club, the O Club, which they don't exist any longer in the military. And I went in there, and, here I am. I'm 21. I said, okay, I want a Schaefer. A who? A Peels? A who? What beer do you have? Because these were all East Coast,
Right.
and I was very guarded as to what I knew and what I didn't know, and it proved out very quickly. So I got something to eat and something to drink there, and I found a place to lay my head for the night. And from there, they met in the morning at the officers' club and bussed us to class. And classes were in 2 sessions. One started early and was finished at noon. The other started at 1 and was finished about 6 at night. And you'd vary depending on what particular part of the course you were in. And it was aircraft maintenance officer. We learned all about airplanes and how to repair them, up to and including removing an engine from a T-33 and reinstalling it. So that gave us our hands-on experience. And then they tried to make everybody into a pilot. So they took us up in a T-33, and the pilot gets up to 10,000 feet and says, the plane's yours, just don't fly through a cloud. So I take the stick and I'm flying. I put it off to the left, look down, right at center, right, look down. I said, that's a long way down. Keep burning. I did not want to have to eject, because he told us that if I say eject, you're going to be flying a solo if you don't eject. Then they took us up in a 121, a C-1. It was the base commander's airplane. It was a Constellation. And everybody got a chance behind the controls of that, and numerous people got air sick because over the sky for about 4 hours.
Now, was flying something that you wanted to do, or were they just thrusting it upon you?
I had not signed up for flying because my parents would not sign for me going for pilot training. My mother said, you're not going to become gun fodder. It was the same reason in high school I could not go out for football. Although I've always been relatively big, my father played semi-pro football. And he jumped on a fumble, they jumped on him, he broke his collarbone. And my mother wouldn't let him sign for me to go to that either. But when I was down on Ramey, and I'll go into that, I was maintenance officer for the Aero Club, and I do have a private pilot's license. So I proved I could fly.
Mm-hmm. All right. And these aircraft that you were flying, were these still propeller driven, or were you flying jets by then? Or
All jets.
Okay.
Until we got into the Aero Club. And the Aero Club, of course, was all private style aircraft. Mm-hmm. But so I spent 7 months at Chanute. And then when the weather got warmer, every Saturday we had to march and review. And Chanute was a big training base for enlisted and officers. And we had to lead a group of enlisted through this pass and review. And it was hot, and the first thing I told them, don't lock your knees. I don't want to have to pick anybody up from passing out. And the time I was there, luckily, nobody passed out on me. So, and then when that was over, you're gone for the weekend. So, and you'd get some visitors there, because growing up in New Jersey, people could come up to the Cape and see us on Otis. Then they sent me to, the last 6 weeks there, I went home and got married. Mm-hmm. I was engaged. Harriet, my wife, is the first girl I ever went out with more than once. And last June was 50 years for us.
Very good.
So
when had you actually met her? Was that while you were in college or before that, or?
Long before that.
Okay.
When she was 12 and I was 13, we were in a youth group together. Whenever the youth group would do anything, go bowling, go to the movies, go roller skating. Roller skating, they don't do that anymore, do they? We were together, and then we'd have some bicycle dates in the summer. She called me up and said, I can't go on a bicycle date, I've got the measles. Well, we went to the same junior high. She was a year behind me. Usually in the hallway, I didn't even acknowledge her when we passed. Sometimes I did. Then we went to the same high school. And again, usually I didn't even acknowledge her. We were in totally separate groups of, cliques. And then I went off to college, and she went to a different college, Patterson State Teachers College. Again, totally separate in our social lives. Then I was riding down the main street in town, and I looked over the car next to me. This was in my junior and senior year in college, and she was riding next to me. Something looked different. And I nodded to her, and I put it in the old memory bank. Then I ran into her. She was at the store my mother worked at. I was picking up my mother. and in the aisleway, and I barely acknowledged her, but something looked different again. Put that in the memory bank, and I had this all planned now. At the high holidays, there was always an intermission. I walked over to her and I asked if she wanted to go for a walk. She said I could have knocked her over with a feather. 6 weeks later, we were pinned. 6 months later, we were engaged. And it's been a great life since.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. So to go back into, you spent about 7 months at Chanute,
Right.
and that time, and so you're doing mechanical engineering. Now, where did the meteorology thing come in? Was that when you go to Puerto Rico, or?
They sent me wrong orders.
Oh, okay.
When they asked where I was going to be trained, they said, "You're not yet." They rescinded those orders and gave me the orders as aircraft maintenance officer, which was at the time a very critical skill in the Air Force, as I came to find out as I got on active duty. But we took about a month honeymoon waiting to get the final orders to go down to Puerto Rico, and we ended up back home. Then we got on an airplane. It was August 13th of 1965, a Friday the 13th. The plane was empty. It was about 8 people on this big DC-8. But we got down there, landed at Ramey, or at the airport in San Juan, and had to wait for the bus to pick us up. We flew in uniform. I was in my blues, and it was hotter than heck. And we had to wait for an airman to come in so that the bus could take us all back. Well, we start driving to the base, which is the other side of the island, the north side of the island. It was northeast, and San Juan is more northwest.
Southwest?
Northwest, yes. Anyhow, we driving there, and it's about 10:30 at night, and the bus breaks down. And he rolls it into what he recognized was a garage. And they found the problem. The battery had discharged. It wasn't charging the vehicle. And they tightened the belt, but he didn't have a battery to jumpstart it. Well, here he starts hollering, "Mira, mira, mira." And these men start coming out of the houses. And growing up outside of New York, the reputation of the Puerto Rican populace was not very good. Well, they got behind this bus and started pushing it. And they jump-started it that way. And right then I said, well, maybe I'm the one that's wrong and not them.
Okay.
And my attitude changed in that 10 minutes very much.
So it sounds like this is something they'd done before.
Well, I don't know if they'd ever done it before, but these people were everyday folk, and they were there to help. This was a blue school bus. Here in this country, during Vietnam, they'd have thrown rocks and spit and cussed at us, because I did have that in ROTC in uniform. But they did it right, and I felt that my attitude was wrong at that point.
You mentioned you were already encountering kind of anti-war, anti-military sentiment even while you were still in ROTC.
Yes.
Okay, because you mentioned it was the sort of official American beginning in Vietnam on some level is spring of '65 when the Marines land. Although we had already Air Force and other units deployed ahead of time. So how early did you start to encounter?
There was a lot more in Vietnam than we ever want to admit prior to. But I was in once a week up to my junior year. We wore uniform twice a week when we became in the advanced corps. And you'd walk through town, and the news media was anti-us, and that got the people. Not too different than today's news media.
Okay, but even in '63, '64, I mean, because you graduated in '64, right?
Right.
Yeah. So but that would have normally one would not expect a lot of the anti-war sentiment to be going.
It was
that early, but at least where you were, you were
in Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah. Could start anywhere. Or was it just kind of more of a general kind of anti-military or anti-interventionism? Because I guess we were going in other places, Dominican Republic and other things like that,
Well,
in the early '60s.
When we get down on Puerto Rico, we'll talk about the Dominican Republic.
Okay. But anyway, so it's August 65, so Vietnam. Now, I guess also while you were training, were you much aware of stuff beginning to happen in Vietnam, or does that when, or did you
Not
figure?
significantly, no.
Okay. And then when you were at Chanute, were you paying any attention to that?
I was, either getting up very early in the morning and trying to get through class with a good grade, or late in the afternoon. So no, we didn't have a lot of contact outside the base.
Okay. So now we've gotten you out to Ramey Field in Puerto Rico,
Right.
August 65. You get to the base. Okay, now what?
And they took us to the visiting officers' quarters, and my wife and I get there, and we're about ready to get in bed, and all of a sudden there's a pounding on the door. And it was my squadron commander, who I had never met. He had never met me, a Major Morrison. And he says, "Do you want to go to your house?" I said, "That sounds great." So they packed us all up and drove us to this house, which the administrative officer had secured for us. And had we not arrived then, it would have had to go back to be issued to somebody else. And it was a duplex house, and we had one half of it. We stumbled into bed. Come that following morning, all of a sudden there's a knock on the front door. And it was a kid, Stanley Tumadalski, who had been at Chanute with me. I had to stumble. I said, "Keep knocking, because I don't know where the front door is." So we stumbled there, and we found that. And, it was a very, I won't say it was a great house, but it was nice. It was more than adequate. It was 2 bedrooms, living room, dining area, kitchen. And the laundry room was outside, because in Puerto Rico you could do that. And from there, I went to find out where the squadron was. And we had to cross the runway to get to the building that I was working out of. And I worked out of that for the next 3 years.
All right. Now, what was the nature of your duties? What did you start out doing?
The first day, this Captain Erzik, who had been an air policeman, they needed maintenance officers, as I mentioned before. Aircraft maintenance officers was a critical skill, and he volunteered, and they transitioned him. He did not know an awful lot about aircraft maintenance, and I got in. He drove me around the flight line, and we got my badge and pass to get out on the flight line, etc. And as it ended up, I was initially a flight line maintenance officer, where I'd drive in the maintenance vehicle and go from airplane to airplane, finding out what condition they were in and what had to be done. Now, we had 16 B-52G models and 16 KC-135s. Besides, we had 2 U-3As, which were Cessna 310s, 2 C-54s, and that had flown in the Berlin airlift, and C-45 CAP aircraft that we had to take care of the maintenance on. And I had to check on the maintenance, check on the status, get specialists out as necessary. When the flight, I was also the one who signed off on the forms that allowed the aircraft to fly. The enlisted group, and we had some very good people. We had a lot of World War II people still out there. And I can talk about some of them because I honored them greatly. And they'd get the specialists out there. We coordinated with maintenance control, because we were in the OMS, Organizational Maintenance Squadron. The FMS, Field Maintenance Squadron, supplied the specialists. The A&E Squadron, Armament and Electronics, took care of the electronics on the aircraft. And although, compared to today's aircraft, a B-52 at that time, and they've been well modified since, had nothing, but they were still pretty complicated for the era.
They're still awfully big.
The aluminum overcast. And, the basic airframe is well over 50 years old. The last one was built in 1962. and now the grandchildren of the pilots are flying them. But the plane is quite a bit different than when I worked on it.
All right. Now, while you have these different parts of the maintenance command and they all kind of do their thing, you're the one who in the end is kind of responsible for saying, yes, the whole thing is ready to go?
Correct.
Okay.
As an officer, after a plane flies, the forms are filled out, and the seriousness of the discrepancy is indicated with either a red slash or a red X or just a dash. A dash that can fly without any work, a slash, a diagonal you had to do some repair, a red X it could not fly with unless I deemed it was safe. And this is something that an enlisted man could repair a red X, but it had to be repaired. I could let the plane fly without it being repaired. And this was the responsibility. And listening to your speech at the United Veterans Council, the enlisted people poo-pooed a lot of officers. And yes, I saw some of the officers that they were talking about. I hoped I was not one of them. Like I say, I had a lot of World War II people. One flew the hump out of Burma, Sergeant Chilcote. Another one was a waist gunner on B-17s, had an ME-109 to his credit. Another one was God is my co-pilot Scott's crew chief in P-51s. These guys had a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience. We had a sergeant who, he was a senior master sergeant, he did not make chief, George Kessler, who taught me more than any one person in my life. He worked on Jenny biplanes, so he had many years of experience. And he ran the maintenance truck, calling specialists, but he also was put over in base flight where they had the recip aircraft, and he took care of the older enlisted guys who weren't going up anymore but were spending their time doing good work, but he covered for them very well.
So in a way, you're still in this situation. You're the green one at
Yes.
that point. You come in, you're the newly minted second lieutenant. You've been through a training program at Chanute, but you haven't done anything really in a squadron. And I guess with infantrymen, you go in, you get assigned to a platoon. The first thing you do is you start talking to the non-coms and listen to them. And how did you present yourself when you joined the unit?
When this Stanley Tumadalski, who I said went through school with me, was assigned to the same squadron I was, he started associating with the airmen his own age. I started associating with the senior sergeants. As a maintenance squadron, we had a lot of senior master sergeants, chief master sergeants, guys with many, many years of experience, and they are the ones who taught me. We had a bomber branch, a tanker branch, ground power equipment, etc. And that's who I associated with. He got in trouble because he did not. The guys wouldn't trust him, they wouldn't tell him anything. Because of that, and he ended up getting moved out of the squadron. I hoped that I could learn, and I had a Sergeant Watson who made master sergeant before I was born. And while I was down there, he made senior master sergeant, which was a lot of years. He made it in 9 months in World War II, which was not unusual. But I respected these people because of their experience and their knowledge. And that was the one thing they told us, that you're going to be supervising men older than your father. And you have to understand that and work with that. You know, they say, well, as an officer, you can give them an order and they have to follow it. That's true. But there's 17 different speeds they can follow that order at.
Okay. Now, how many other officers were in your squadron?
There was the officer I reported to, there was a squadron commander and an administrative officer, and then there were 2 other flight line maintenance officers. Most of the time, Usually we'd lose one of those, and there were two of us that had to cover the flight line 24 hours a day.
Okay. Now, when you get there, late summer of '65, what was going on in the base? What kinds of missions were going on, or training exercises?
We had 6 bombers and 6 tankers sitting alert. The bombers were nuke loaded. They were EWO prepared, electronic warfare. They were prepared to do their mission. Then the other planes were on training missions, and they'd fly about every 3rd day, the bombers. And the flight crews, when the wing commander would come out to the flight line, myself or my equivalent was the first one they'd look up. What are my planes like? Are they ready to go? And I had to have a status of every aircraft out there. And then we'd get alerts. The guys who sat alert were allowed to go certain places on base. The bomber pilot, the crews, and the tanker crews. They say the tanker crew was the only aircraft that had a enlisted man with 3 officers taking him to work every day. So there was a good interaction between, being I don't have Army or Navy experience, I cannot relate it to it. But in the Air Force, you did not have a strong distinction. You worked with the enlisted closely because they were doing the work. And yes, you knew you could always give them an order. But as a good officer, you did not. It's not any different than a manager in industry today. You know, either you're a good manager or you're a bad manager. You work with your people, or you don't work with your people. And I felt a good relationship with the enlisted. As I say, that Senior Master Sergeant George Kessler taught me more than anybody else in my life. I'd make a comment, Sarge, I said, what do you think about this? If he liked it, he'd say, yes, sir. If he didn't, but sir. And he was typically correct. And that's how we got along. We had a World Commanders Call every year down at Ramey, and every star in the Air Force would get there. And we'd line up under the flags, and he was wearing his whites and a chrome helmet, etc. They'd come out, and we'd all salute, and they'd walk by and say, Lieutenant, and they'd, George, how you doing? They all knew him by a first name. But I was put over at that time to be prepared for this, and I would drive the Follow Me truck and park these, and the captain would get out. Well, I have General so-and-so. I said, fine, here's your ground cables, here's your chocks. Take care of your plane. I got to go meet somebody else. You know, they all tried pulling rank on me also. And down there I went from 2nd lieutenant through 1st lieutenant and left there as a captain.
All right.
So.
Now, was it normal for officers, junior officers, to kind of stay in one base for 3 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It was where they grew up. Now, our aircraft also had Hound Dog cruise missiles on them, the B-52s. And as I say, we'd have alerts where the crews would run out to their aircraft or drive out and start the engines. Sometimes they'd taxi, depending on what the alert was. Sometimes they wouldn't. Then the flight line maintenance officer was responsible to get what they called a cartridge, which would be inserted in the engines to start them. It was like a big shotgun cartridge. And so you had to be alert all the time for this occurring. And then I was commander of what they called the mobility team. Now, if we actually went to war and the B-52s would take off first, the KC-135s would follow, the tankers. Before any of them broke ground, myself and the rest of the mobility team would leave the base, go to a civilian airport, and wait for one of the returning tankers to land there and pick us up. And this tanker had equipment aboard for maintenance. They'd fly us to a foreign country which at the time I was aware of where it was, and we were an invasion force, in essence. We'd land there. We were responsible for a certain number of airports, civilian airports around there that the bombers knew about. And our job was to retrieve these bombers, do safety of flight maintenance only. A B-52 is an 8-engine aircraft. If he had 2 engines out, he could still fly. If he only had 3 main landing gear down, he could still work. And we get him back to the United States and to be reloaded and launch again.
Okay. And of course, this is the Cold War era, and the likely targets, particularly for a nuclear armed B-52, are going to be places like Soviet Union or China or something like that.
Well, not so much China.
Yeah, at this point, primarily Soviet. And there, I guess while the B-52 has a long range and can be refueled, it couldn't get all the way from Puerto Rico to some place in the middle of Eurasia and back again without landing, right?
Well, we used to fly a Chrome Dome mission. It was a 45-day mission, 2 aircraft a day. They took off in the morning. They were armed and loaded, ready to hit a target. They flew from Puerto Rico. They'd catch a tanker before they hit the Mediterranean. They'd fly a racetrack around the Mediterranean. They'd come back, catch a tanker to come back across the Atlantic and land. 27 hours. If one of those aircraft or both of those aircraft were replaced in the air by 2 others that were taking off before they landed, if 2 could not make it, they were refueled and continued to fly. Yes, a B-52 is a very long-range aircraft, especially with the air refueling capability. You know, we refueled SR-71s. We had to configure our tankers because they use a different fuel. And we had a U-2 operate out of our base, and when I was in base flight, I had to take care of that. We'd have B-25s come up from Venezuela. They were flying them. We had to take care of those. Then we used to have the Air National Guard had a mission down there every year. They'd bring F-84s in, they'd bring Canberras in from the Air National Guard. Then the Puerto Rican Air National Guard, which was tasked with our defense, switched from F-86s to F-104s. And they put a number of those in the ocean. And they used to run mock attacks on our B-52s, and that was always a fun game for them.
But they put some of the F-104s in the ocean?
Yes. Oh, yeah, when they were first learning.
Okay, training accidents, yes.
Yeah, that was a difficult aircraft to learn on.
All right.
When I first went down to the base, there was a P-51 sitting out in the back 40. It had a pilot from the Dominican Republic, he was looking for asylum. He came across wave top level with armed machine guns and rockets, did a loop over the alert force, landed, and ran out of gas. And we never knew he was coming. There was a lot of comments about that.
All right. So what was going on in the Dominican at that point that would lead someone to do that?
They were having their, armed fight against Papa Doc, and I think it was Papa Doc, wasn't it? Baby Doc?
That's in Haiti, just
Yeah,
the other half
the
of
other
the
side
island.
of the island.
But yeah, there was an uprising or revolution in
A revolution.
Dominican as well.
Yes.
Because like the 82nd Airborne went down there at some point. And,
Yeah.
now, did that kind of activity, aside from having this plane show up, did that affect you at all, or was your mission so different?
No, you were not going to use B-52s against Haiti, especially nuke-loaded, or against the Dominican Republic. We had no conventional weapons on base. All of ours were nuke. We had the Hound Dog missile, which were also nuke-loaded. And, were we on alert? Yes. We had that U-2 operate out of the base. He'd take off. On high altitude weather research. It's amazing. They always flew towards Cuba. And it was quite something. Okay. We had a B-52 had just come back from depot modification. We had a reverse pattern at our base. Instead of taking off and braking to the left, to the right, in our base you broke to the right, or to the left rather. And this first flight back at our base, at 1,500 feet, he broke left and went over into the water at a 180-degree angle.
Really?
The radar navigator, who was the bombardier, and the navigator sit downstairs in a B-52. The radar navigator was a neighbor of mine. They both got out of the plane. The gunner, who sits upstairs riding backwards, got out. The electronic warfare officer, the pilot, co-pilot, and a crew chief who was aboard it did not get out. They went in with the aircraft. And I was initially on the accident investigation board for that airplane, aircraft 494. And I got pulled off of that because the captain who I was reporting to was the officer in charge of the crew chief. And he and the wife got into it, and they pulled him off and put me in place, summary court officer, which was not an enjoyable task. I'd rather have learned more about the crash, but in later years, my son was stationed in Alabama, and that's where the records all are kept, and he got me in, and I was able to look at the rest of the accident investigation.
Were you able to figure out what actually happened?
The co-pilot, in their seat pack, is a survival kit. The survival kit contains life raft. His life raft inflated and pushed him up and forward, pushing the control column forward, and at 1,500 feet, you don't have time to recover. Another aircraft out of Homestead Air Force Base was at about 40,000 feet when that same thing happened. And there was an instructor pilot sitting between the pilot and co-pilot, and it was the pilots that went off. He took a pencil and started puncturing the life raft, and at about under 30,000 feet, they were able to recover. You didn't have that time.
Okay, so you were equivalent of defective airbags even then.
Very true.
Or something like that would happen to you. Okay, now you are in Puerto Rico for a pretty busy 3 years in terms of the U.S. military and everything else. I mean, Vietnam has heated up. We're using plenty of B-52s over Vietnam.
Different model.
Yeah, all of this time. How much did you pay attention to all of that and what was going on there?
We supported with KC-135s. We'd send the actual aircraft over besides the crews. The B-52s, we'd send crews over because those were D model bombers, where ours were Gs from Puerto Rico. And yeah, we'd hear back from the crews, and all the aircraft commanders knew who I was because they talked to me about the forms on their aircraft before they took off. So you'd get an opportunity to talk to them. We'd have the KC-135s go over to Japan on Young Tiger missions, and they'd bring back all kinds of things for us. I had a Honda brought back for me. But this was not uncommon, and I paid for it, and it was legal. So.
All right. Now, was there any prospect of eventually sending you to Guam or Thailand or someplace like that?
Well, I was sent to Kincheloe from there. If I had stayed in, my next move would have been to Vietnam. But I chose to get out at that time because I could see that Vietnam was going to be starting to wind down. There would be a lot of officers and men getting out of the service and to get a job and all. But the reason I did not go to Vietnam is my B-52s were nuke loaded.
And so they needed people in these specialized jobs for those aircraft, which was still an essential part of national security at that point.
Exactly.
All right.
We don't have aircraft sitting alert like we did then, and as I say, the B-52 is totally different today. But in Vietnam, with the D models at 40,000 feet, all of a sudden the ground would start erupting around them. They'd start dropping bombs way over there and wouldn't finish till way over there. 105, 500-pounders, an awful lot of weaponry, especially when there was a flight of planes up there.
Right. Okay. Now, when did you actually change bases and go up to Kincheloe?
In August of '68.
Okay.
I was sent up there. Now, I was a captain. I was replacing a first lieutenant who had very little experience, and that's what I was taking over as maintenance supervisor. I reported to the squadron commander, who was a grounded pilot, had about that much maintenance experience. He had me and an administrative officer reporting to him, and I had 5 officers and 177 men under me. And again, it was, you find out who the senior sergeants are, you start working with them, and I had a number of them. Some I used to go hunting with. Sergeant Greg Garinger, he was in charge of our non-powered ground equipment, and we had cherry pickers up there because of the ice and that, and had to de-ice the planes. Well, they had a heater on the back of these, and we had 2 cherry pickers. There was 1 spare heater on base, and the base maintenance was going to get it before I ever would. I let Sergeant Garinger know that I'd sure like to have one. One day he called me over to his hangar and he says, "Sir." I looked up and, "Very good, sir." "Very good, Sergeant." He had one.
So did you again have kind of a cadre of guys who went back to World War II or Korean War vintage? Or?
Yes, yeah. And again, I had their respect and they had my respect. I had a Sergeant Sutherland who I moved as my NCOIC, and he shared the office with me. When I had a question, I needed somebody who could answer it for me. And it was Christmas 1968. We got hit with snow, typical UP snow. And so the aircraft had to be moved from one side of the parking ramp, that side cleaned, and then put back. And being it was Christmas, I let my officers all off, because it wasn't my holiday. And Sergeant Sutherland turned to me and said, "Sir, if you need help out there," he says, "I don't have family here or anything, just give me a call." Well, about midnight, I was half frozen. We had moved the planes. And I called him up. And, "Please, Sut." He came out. He finished it up. But, to move a B-52 on snow and ice, it takes 3 tow tractors all buddy-barred together. And so that's what I did that day. And it was respect both ways. These are the guys whose hands were on and made the immediate decisions. Yeah, I could give them orders and all, but it's not the way you work.
Okay. How would you characterize the morale of the enlisted personnel in these units you were with?
We had 22-year-old crew chiefs on KC-135s. These guys were out there on their time off cleaning and prepping. Same thing with the B-52s. These young guys took responsibility. They knew these aircraft were flying over large cities, and besides the value of the aircraft, what they were flying over was immense. And they had a lot of pride in what they did. And yeah, there were always some. The Air Force was lucky. You tested the enlisted and they were rated 1 through 4, with 4 being the top people. We did not have to take any 1s and 2s and very few 3s. These people, these enlisted guys, had a lot of internal strength.
Okay. And they came in with sort of often levels of education or practical skill that made them useful or effective.
The skills and the knowledge in their civilian life, yeah, that was, it made it easier for us, because these kids were, and they were kids, and they were going to spend their time in and get out, and they knew it, we knew it. It was the tech sergeants and above who actually ran the show. As I say, down on Puerto Rico, I was also maintenance officer for our Aero Club. We had Cessna 150s and 172s, a fleet of 7 aircraft. We ended up trading them for Piper 140s and 180s. And I got my private pilot's license, but again, I had 2 civilians who worked on those aircraft for me, and I had to supervise them also. And in base flight transient maintenance, the base flight people were civilians, the transient maintenance, and they were mostly Puerto Rican nationals. And so I had to learn to work with them also. It was a great experience. I got along with these guys. We used to have an ORI, Operational Readiness Inspection, no notice. You knew your vulnerability period, but all of a sudden, and it was typically on a Sunday, a KC-135 would divert into our base, and you were now under inspection. And that's when you had to take, we took tests. The mobility team that I was describing before had to meet and have all our equipment checked, etc. All the planes had to fly and make bomb runs, etc. Well, we passed with flying colors this one event, and afterwards, down on the beach at Puerto Rico, we were having a party. And I told my wife that as an officer, I wasn't going to get in the way of the enlisted men. I'd be home early. Well, I went down there and celebrated with them, and I said, "Oh, well, guys, have a good time. I'm leaving." "Sir, you can't. We're going over the NCO club." I still don't know how I got home. This is how I got along with these senior sergeants, which I was very proud of, and am to this day. As I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more patriotic. What I see out in the world today, they say, why aren't the kids patriotic today? Because they're not taught history. Our school system does an atrocious job in teaching the history of this nation and what we've gone through and what we're going through. I won't talk about our political atmosphere because that's an individual thought.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case where, at the high school level, you're trying to cover all of U.S. history, that, you're lucky to get a week or so on World War II. Vietnam tends to be a blip. And a lot of the post-World War II stuff, it gets compressed or lost track of. And even World War II sometimes boils down to, Pearl Harbor, atomic bomb, Holocaust, and occasional Japanese internment. Some teachers will find ways of doing more, and some school systems do more than others. But yeah, but there's not much of a sense of it. And of course, the other thing is that, there's no draft. Small numbers of people go in and get used. Now, the guys, the younger enlisted men that you had, did you have a sense that some of those guys had joined the Air Force because they didn't want to go into the Army in Vietnam, or did they just like planes?
No, they chose the better of the fields as they, you mentioned the nuclear bombing in Japan. Our deputy commander for maintenance for a period of time on Puerto Rico was a Colonel Tom Farabee. Tom Farabee was bombardier on the Enola Gay, and I worked for him, and he signed my OERs, my orders, and he came here to town to sign autographs, and we went to dinner with him, and so my son had a chance to ask him any question he wanted. Steve. My older son was a graduate of Northwestern University, ROTC. The top 10% get regular commissions versus reserve commissions, which I had a reserve commission. He had a regular commission. September, he retired after 25 years in the Air Force. He worked with NATO, etc. He, at Eglin Air Force Base, was in charge of the Seek Eagle program, which tested everything and anything that attached to an airplane and dropped from an airplane. So.
All right. Now,
I hope to think that I influenced it.
Oh, quite possible. All right. So let's see. We're looking at this. Now, the other thing, of course, is there's a lot of stuff going on, certainly politically, especially in 68. I mean, you get the sort of total or completion of the turn against the war after Tet Offensive. You get Johnson not running. You get King assassinated, Kennedy assassinated. Were there ripple effects of any of that in the places where you were?
The effects were that we were not allowed to fight the mission in Vietnam like it should have been fought militarily. It was a political war. It was not a military war. the comments have come out after the war that if you had gone one day longer, the Viet Cong were about to give up. This came from a top Viet Cong military man. But, oh, you can't go here, you can't go there, you can't do this, you can't do that. This is not what we need. We have the same effect today.
But was that something that people kind of talked about on the bases where
Yes.
you were?
Yes. Because we wanted to, we were trained. We were trained military. We wanted to go in and do our job. And don't tell me I can't shoot him if he's shooting at me.
All right. And then, what about sort of the questions of race and things like that? I mean, did you have black enlisted men or
Yes.
officers working with you? And
Yes. We had one black chief master sergeant who every year had to pass his physical, and he was a martial arts fighter, and he had trouble getting his weight down. He's a nice guy, though, but no, we did not see, I did not see any problems. If you got into base supply down on Puerto Rico, where most of the guys were Puerto Ricans, they could spend 2 tours there, then had to go away for a tour and could return. They spoke more Spanish than they did English, and sometimes that was a bit of a problem. But these were typically not the more dedicated, enlisted people. This Sergeant Kessler, we got a note from base supply. If an aircraft cannot fly because it does not have a part for it, it's GNORS, grounded, not operational for supply. Well, he'd go into base supply at night, and he wouldn't look in this one where it was supposed to be. He'd look all around where a part was misfiled, and he'd come out with a part. Well, the colonel in charge of base supply was very much in problems when they had to take a plane off of GNORS and put it as flying status. And we got a letter that he was no longer allowed in base supply. But this was the difference of a hands-on individual, a man who knew what he was looking for, compared to somebody who just worked with numbers. We see that today in the parts we order for automotive.
And there's maybe a reason why a colonel in base supply is a colonel in base supply as opposed to something else.
Right, he's a pencil pusher.
All right. Now, did you and your wife have any children while you were
Yes. Our oldest, Jim, was born down on Puerto Rico in 1967 in the base hospital there. And so he was born into the Air Force also.
All right. And it having, a young child and so forth, did that also influence your decision to get out? Or?
Yeah, I'd say it probably. My biggest influence, I was a non-rated officer. I did not have wings. I was a ground pounder. And I could not take my squadron commander's position because that was a rated position. And I didn't like that idea. I wanted, he had myself and a administrative officer under him, and I had all the maintenance people under me, but I couldn't do his job. And that bothered me. And that's one of that, and the fact that the war we could see winding down. We chose to get out at that time.
Okay. So when did you actually get your discharge?
Oh,
Or the release from active duty, or however you want to phrase
release
it?
in August of '69. We moved to Pittsburgh, where I had worked for Continental Can after graduating college, but before going in the Air Force, putting pop-tops on beer cans, a job that trained Tim Van Zee could have done. But so I went back to them as a project engineer.
Okay.
And spent 4 years there, and then moved up to Bradford, Pennsylvania with Corning Glass, and then back to New Jersey with Crescent Wire and Cable, making electrical wire, and then out here with Walter Hagen Golf.
Okay.
And worked with Cascade Engineering, and then Domtar Gypsum, and then GP bought Domtar Gypsum, and we started our own company, Steve's Antique Auto Repair.
All right.
Named after my middle son.
All right.
He was there first, and he'll be there longer.
Okay. And so now, had that been something that was a hobby of yours all along, or something that you pick up later? Or?
It was a hobby, and the building we own, we bought as a hobby building. And people knew that we could do the work, so at night we were doing it. And he was in charge of the shop at another place, and they got into some problems with financial. And he walked in one Wednesday, laid his uniforms on the counter, and said, "I quit." They said, "You can't." He says, "Watch me." That afternoon, Steve's Antique Auto started.
All right.
So, and we do anything 1972 and earlier. And we'll be at the Metro Cruise.
All right. And something covered fully by WKTV, which
Yes.
is why we're doing this
Yes.
particular shoot. All right. Now, to look back at the time that you spent in the Air Force, I mean, how do you think that affected you, or what did you take out of it?
Initially, I did not think it would have as great of effect on me as it ended up doing. When we came here, I got involved with the American Legion, and that has become a big part of our life. I was post commander for 2 years. I've been in other positions at the post. My wife is our auxiliary chaplain and our district auxiliary chaplain, and I served in the 5th District, which we are. Met an awful lot of people. The state commanders and all probably know me better than most people, but and it's had a big effect on our life since.
Okay. And are you involved in different kinds of things, maybe that support veterans coming back, from the more recent conflicts out of Iraq and Afghanistan, or was the Legion trying to do anything for them?
Yes, we'd like to have more contact. We view our post as a very friendly post. It has that reputation. Post 459 on Michigan Avenue, Northeastern Post. And we don't have the large room for events and that, but we have karaoke and euchre, and a lot of people, especially the older people, view the Legion posts as a place to go drink. Well, we have that also, but we do a lot more than that. We were sending packages over. We'd send 150 packages overseas. Get together and get the stuff donated. And so, yeah, we do whatever we can do to. We volunteer at the Vets Home. My wife volunteers at the new hospital, and she's in the program No Vet Dies Alone. She volunteers for that. That's something I couldn't do. I give all the credit in the world to her.
All right. And we're going to be talking with her as well, so we'll
Yes.
get to get her side of the story. So thank you very much for coming in today and sharing your story.
Surely.
All right.
Thank you.